Alright, so this video is all about EDF jets and what I have learned over the past year, because I have only been flying EDF jets for a year now. And I don't have a lot of flights on any of them. I would say this F16 is probably the one I have the most flights on. I would say I've only got about 30 or 40 flights on this airframe and less on the other jets that I've flown. But what I learned, one of the things I learned about EDF jets, and I wanted to make this video while it was still fresh in my memory, since I'm still fairly new to EDF jets, but one of the things you want to do is you want to pick your EDF jets wisely. And I'll tell you why here in a minute. I'm going to go over my favorite EDFs that I've flown so far. I've got 3 that are just fantastic flying EDF jets. I have had the opportunity to fly 5 different EDF jets over the past year. 2 of them were not so good, and both of those have already been retired. But when I say, I will have links to the playlist for each one of these aircraft that'll be overlaid at the end of the video. There's also links to them in the show notes. There are links to the aircraft in the show notes and some components like ESCs, EDF units, gyro, transmitter, lipos. I think that's about it. But when I say pick your EDF wisely, I've always loved the look of the T-33 and the F-86. Those are pretty old airframes, you know, in modern times. Not a more, you know, modern airframe like the F-16 here, but. And I don't know if it's just coincidence or if it's because they're old designs, but I had a 64 millimeter F-86 Saberjet. Had some really bad flight tendencies to it, bad flight characteristics. And the T-33, which is also a very old airframe, it had some really bad flight characteristics to it as well. I haven't seen those bad flight characteristics out of the more modern, you know, more aerodynamic airframes. So I think going forward, for me anyway, I'm going to stick with the more modern airframes. Like I said, it could just be a coincidence, but I don't think so. I think it comes down to airframe design. So even though I love the look of those 2 EDF jets, they're not comparable. They're just not comparable to the stability and the flight characteristics of the newer, more modern airframes. So keep that in mind. On these EDF jets, space is a premium. There's not a lot of room in that battery compartment for a very large lipo. I have had to carve out underneath that canopy on at least 2 of the 3 EDF jets that I'm going to talk about in order to get a decent sized lipo inside of it. So bear that in mind. You may have to carve some foam depending on what lipos you have on hand or what lipos you're going to purchase. But the lipos that I wanted to use were just a little too tall for the canopy to close over the top of it. So I did have to do some carving on that. Also, the area underneath the canopy on these EDF jets, this is the weak spot, you know, where you're missing all that foam on top. So my recommendation for any of these EDF jets, and why they don't put carbon reinforcement in there on these factory planes, knowing that that's the weak spot on the fuselage, I don't know. But none of mine had carbon reinforcement underneath this canopy. So I did my own carbon reinforcement under the canopy on all my EDF jets, and I would recommend that you do the same thing, because it is not going to take much to break that nose off, right here, midpoint on the canopy. So that has probably saved that front of that fuselage a few times with some hard landings and stuff with it. All right, I also found that EDF jets are the most affected at high altitude. Now the area where I fly is approximately 5,700 feet above sea level. That's over a mile up above sea level. And the EDF jets are most affected by high altitude compared to quadcopters, helicopters, and my traditional planes. I don't know if it's because that the surface area of that fan is so much smaller, and basically it's forcing airflow in through the fuselage to produce the thrust. But you can tell that it definitely affects the power system on these EDF jets at high altitude. So if you're at high altitude, that's something to keep in mind. You don't get as much flight time and you don't get as much power from the EDF jets that you do with traditional motor and prop planes. The other thing is you don't get instantaneous power from them either, so you need a little more throttle management with EDF jets than you need with a traditional plane that has a motor and prop. Because with the traditional motor and prop, when you hit the throttle, the response is almost instantaneous, but it's not that way with the EDF unit. It seems like the EDF unit has to have a little bit of time to spool up to provide that thrust. So if you get in trouble because you're too slow, you're not going to get saved by hammering the throttle with an EDF jet the way you would with the motor and prop plane. So that's something else to think about too, is it does take a little better throttle management and keeping your speed up a little bit better with the EDF jets than it does a traditional motor and prop plane. Okay, so they're typically as easy to launch and land as a traditional plane. I haven't had, as long as the aircraft has sufficient power, because I had one that just was atrocious. As long as the plane has sufficient power, it is pretty easy to do hand launches with them and to bring them in for a landing. The F16 here, this is the Eachine F16 50mm EDF jet. And it's really easy to hand launch, and it's easy to bring it in for landings. You can slow down pretty good with it, just bringing it in and flaring it with some high alpha to bring it in for a landing. This is one of the easiest to launch and land jets that I've flown so far. Piece of cake. When you launch it, one thing that you want to be careful of is not to give it too much of an angle when you launch it, because you can stall it. Like I said, you don't have that instantaneous power, and you don't have as much power with the EDF unit that you have from a traditional motor and prop. So going full throttle on launches are the best thing to do until you get really comfortable with launching the jet. And I just give mine about a 10, maybe a 15-degree angle when I launch it, and that helps it pick up speed right away with no chance of stalling. But I have stalled this a couple of times by giving it too much angle on launch, so that's also something to be aware of when you're hand launching these EDF jets. And all the ones that I've flown so far are all hand launch EDF jets. Now, once you get used to it, with I think all three of the EDF jets that I've kept around, I can launch them now that I've gotten more comfortable and gotten used to hand launching them and get the proper angle when I release them. I can typically launch them at about 85 to 90% throttle just fine. And the reason that I do that, once I'm comfortable with it, is I want to save as many of those amps from that LiPo for flight time rather than using so many amps by going full throttle on launch. Because that's when you have it in a static position and you're going full throttle, that's when that power system is going to be using the most amps. So I try to do whatever I can to get the maximum amount of flight time out of the jet, including when I launch it, All right, so let's talk about durability of these EDF jets. So far, I think that the Eachine EDF airframe, because I have two of these, has proven to be, I think, it's been the most abused. It's been the most abused of the three EDF jets that I've kept. And so far, it has proven to be the most durable. Now that's assuming that you do the carbon reinforcement like I did under the canopy, but I've just abused the heck out of the Eachine F16 airframe. And it has held up extremely well. I mean, I've had to glue my rockets and stuff back on it, and you know, I've nosed it in, and I've had several hard landings with it. Like I said, I sold it twice on launch, and it has held up extremely well. It's a very durable EDF jet. So I think that this Eachine F16 50mm EDF jet, if you've never flown an EDF jet before, I think that this is a very, very good candidate for a first EDF jet. I mean, this was my second EDF jet, and I almost got scared off of EDF jets because the first one that I had, which was the 64mm F86 EDF jet, was so bad, and it was so hard to launch because it was so underpowered, especially at high altitude. I was like, well, this isn't working out. So this was the second one and this one was a piece of cake compared to the F86. I've never had, you know, a problem with this other than running out of talent every once in a while or doing something stupid like too much of an angle when I launched it. But otherwise, it has been a fantastic flying, very forgiving, very stable EDF jet, and it's fairly inexpensive. So you might want to look at this one as a possible first EDF jet if you've never flown it before. No. All right, so let's see here. Most of the 50mm EDF jets, well, at least the two that I have, the three. Let me think about that. Three. I've flown 3 50mm EDF jets so far. All of them have been set up for 3S power. Now, and this one's still on 3S power, but that's going to change. 3S power on these 50mm EDF jets, I would say, is adequate, meaning that you can do pretty wide loops with it. It has a fairly decent vertical. You know, you can do split S maneuvers with it, Immelmans, all that kind of stuff. And it's pretty quick on a 3S, but I wouldn't say it's high performance. So, especially at the altitude that I'm at. So, for me, 4S is the way to go on these 50mm EDF jets. And you definitely, in my opinion, don't want to get a 64mm EDF jet that is not rated for a 4S LiPo, because they're bigger and they're heavier. And what I found, converting or switching out the stock ESC, the stock ESCs that they have in are 30 amp ESCs. They're pretty cheap ESCs in my opinion. I've had one of them fail on me. Now I have not changed out the ESC on this one yet, but it's going to get changed out so I can fly it with full 4S power. My Aeros Viper runs off of 4S. I switched out the ESC. I've got links to it in the show notes, but I really like these Hobbywing Skywalker 50 amp ESCs that have a switching voltage regulator on them. They're rated for 4S, and they have a 5 amp voltage regulator on them, so you have plenty of power. And I have not had a single problem with those Hobbywing Skywalker 50 amp ESCs. I absolutely love them. And I purchased a lot of them. I've got a lot of them that I'm going to be putting in other aircraft, including this one. But the difference in performance between this running on 3S and running on 4S is considerable. It is a considerable difference in the amount of power and performance you're going to get. And the other thing that really surprised me, because it's the stock EDF unit, it's got a pretty high kV motor. I think it's a 4500 kV motor, and it's spinning an 11 or 12 blade 50mm EDF fan. I was really surprised that not only did I get more power, but even using the same size LiPo, you know, like 1300 milliamp hour 3S LiPo and a 1300 milliamp hour 4S LiPo. Not only did I get a lot more power and performance from it, doing the same type of mixed mode flying that I was doing on the 3S, I also got a lot more flight time out of it. That really surprised me. I knew I was going to have more power, but with such a high kV motor, I figured the amp draw was going to be enough that I wasn't going to get any additional flight time. But that turned out not to be the case. So my suggestion is if you really want high performance out of these 50 millimeter EDF jets, set them up for 4S power. You're going to be really happy with the amount of power and the additional flight time. That is one of the drawbacks of the EDF units. The EDF jets is pretty short flight times compared to motor and prop planes. Okay, so since I had to replace the stock ESC, and you got to cut it open, you know, to get to the ESC and get everything wired up and everything, it's kind of a pain. It's worth doing. It's definitely worth doing. I wouldn't have kept it as a 3S power system. I wouldn't have been happy with it over the long term. But with the 4S power, I'm extremely happy with it. So what I want to do going forward, if I have the option, is I would rather buy a kit. And this one comes in a kit. The Eachine F18, I think, comes in a kit. And that way you can choose your own electronics, your own EDF unit, your ESC, so that you can set up the 4S right off the bat. And I'm much happier doing that. And then I'm not having to spend additional money to replace components in a jet that's set up for 3S power and not for 4S power. So that's what I prefer to do. I prefer to buy a kit whenever it's available and put my own electronics, my own power system in it. That's something to consider, because those 30 amp ESCs, I've heard people running them. They say they're running 4S on the stock ESCs. I don't think the stock ESC is going to last very long, running 4S power on it, and I would rather replace that and take a chance on losing the airframe when the ESC cuts out. So the 11 to 12 blade fans on these, I've got one. My 64 millimeter EDF unit only has a 5 blade fan. It's got a pretty high whine to it at high RPM. It seems to me that the 11 to 12 blade fans sound much more like a jet. I was really surprised by that. They have a really cool sound to them. So I do like the fan units to have 11 to 12 blade fan blades on them. So that's also something to consider. When you buy one as a kit, you also have the option of converting it to a pusher motor and prop. And I did just that. I also had, this one is the 50 millimeter EDF version plug and fly. And then I also got the F16 kit, the Eachine F16 kit, and converted it to a pusher motor and prop on the tail rather than putting an EDF unit in it. And it was just as I knew it was going to be. I ended up with the same airframe, but I've got more power on a 4S from the motor and the prop than from the EDF unit, and I get a lot more flight time out of it with the motor and prop rather than the EDF unit. So even going from a 3S to a 4S on the EDF version, going from an EDF unit to a motor and a pusher prop on 4S is just about as significant an increase in performance with that conversion as it is going from 3S power to 4S power on the stock EDF unit. So that also gives you another option if you have an opportunity to buy a kit. But that's what I prefer to do. You know, I would like to do both, the EDF and pusher motor and prop. Okay, so we'll take a look at the next one that I decided was a keeper. So the Viper, Arrow's Viper 50 millimeter EDF jet. It's another one that came stock as a 3S power system. You know, what I did before I converted them to 4S was I set up what I called a 3S plus power system. So I put a 4S LiPo in it, I put a load meter on it, and I found out how high I could go with the throttle on 4S power without pushing it over 32 amps, because it's 30 amp ESC. So I clipped the top of the throttle range at that 32 amps, and that typically ended up being about 77%, 78% of the total throttle. And that really increased the performance. It wasn't 4S power, but it was much better than just running 3S power. But the ESC on this one shut down on me coming in for a landing. Now luckily, I had already slowed it down coming in for a landing, and so I didn't have a lot of speed and it wasn't very high off the ground, but the ESC just shut down on me. So I kind of have a feeling that it was the voltage regulator on that cheap 30 amp ESC. I just don't think, you know, I'm sure it had a linear voltage regulator, and those dissipate voltage as heat. And since it was rated for 3S power, I think that full voltage coming from the 4S LiPo, I just think that the BEC, either I burned the BEC up on it, or else it got hot enough that it shut down. That's why I say I wouldn't trust those cheap, low-profile 30 amp ESCs and these 50 millimeter EDF jets on 4S power or 4S voltage. That would be my recommendation anyway. It's almost as easy to launch as the F16. It's not quite as easy to land as the F16 because it just doesn't rotate as well. You know, to bring the nose up when you're coming in for a landing. If you get too slow, it will dip a wing on you. The F16 and the Viper here, none of my EDF jets that I'm currently flying have gyros in them. They just have standard receivers in them, no gyro. But it's a very stable. This one is the one that I've converted from a 3S to 4S. Has really good performance on 4S, much better than it had on 3S. You'll have plenty of fun with it in its stock configuration on 3S. But like I said, it's adequate performance, but it's not high performance. So, but it's another one I think is a good candidate for your first EDF jet. It hasn't proven to be quite as durable as the F16 is, but it's another fantastic flying 50 millimeter EDF jet that for me it's a keeper. I wouldn't want to lose it. I have a lot of fun flying it. I haven't flown my EDF jets in a while because I've been working on other things, other projects, flying some planes I haven't flown in a while, but it's going to be time to take these back out and put them in the air again really soon. So okay, so now I'll show you what my favorite EDF jet has been so far. Be back in a minute. So this is the Zeta Ultra-Z Blaze, and this came as a kit. You could set this up with a single 64 millimeter EDF unit, which is what I did. You could set it up for two 50 millimeter EDF units, or you can set it up as a pusher motor and prop. So it's a very versatile kit. And I saw this, and they're you know, they don't make them anymore. As far as I know, Zeta Technologies is no longer in business. But I was able to find one of these airframes in a kit, and this one flew so well that I went ahead and I ordered the Astro version of this. Now this one has swept wings. The Astro has more of a straight wing. This one is 790 millimeter wingspan, and the Astro is 810 millimeter. But I have found this jet to be the easiest to launch and the easiest to land of the 5 EDF jets that I've flown so far. This one is just as forgiving and maneuverable and aerobatic as the 50 millimeter EDF jets that I just showed you. It's not quite as fast as those on 4S, but of course I've only got a 5-blade fan in here on the 64 millimeter EDF unit. That's the one that I stole out of my F86 after I retired it. So I went ahead and I purchased the Astro kit, which I have yet to put together, and I have an FMS 64 millimeter EDF unit that's rated for 4S. I think the motor is a 3150 kV and it has a 11 or 12 blade fan on it. So the Astro will have even more power than this one has on 4S, and we'll just have to see you know, what kind of speed that one shows compared to this one, since it's going to be producing more thrust than this one is. But I put one of my Hobbywing Skywalker ESCs in here, haven't had a single problem with it. At my absolute favorite one so far. There are links to this kit and also the Astro kit in the show notes. I don't know how many of them are still out there and available, but I was very glad that I was able to pick up one of each of these. So that's one of my winter projects. I will have the Astro ready to go this winter and do the initial flights on it. So anyway, I hope that gives you some good information on what I've discovered with EDF jets over the past year. Like I said, I'm still kind of a newbie with EDF jets because I don't have a lot of flights on the airframes yet, but I'm going to try to get a lot more flights on them, you know, this winter time, you know, time permitting, and I'm going to be taking them out again and putting them in the air very soon. So thank you for watching, and I will see you in the air.